One afternoon when I was a boy, I was sitting in my dad's truck with him outside Indian Head Bank in Keene, New Hampshire, where I grew up. He was trying to balance his checkbook, I think, and to keep me occupied, he gave me a riddle. He said, imagine an arrow in flight and freeze it midway. In that moment, it's neither moving to that spot nor from that spot. It's motionless. And if the same is true for each instant along its path, the question becomes, how can the arrow actually be moving? How is it not just a string of frozen moments? Years later, I realized he had fed me one of Zenos' Paradoxes of motion, which are debated like 2,500 years after Zeno's death. I think I was 9. I mention it because I want to talk about moments in time. If that moment is this week, then that's this year. And that's my life in dots, 1 per week. I'll give you a little bit of scale quickly. This is when I was in school. This is that moment outside the bank with my dad. This is a very lucky week when I met my wife. And these are the weeks I had with my dad, my first 31 years. I want to talk about not only moments in time, but my dad too. He didn't wear a watch, incidentally, and that pretty much describes his relationship with time. He wasn't one to rush through a conversation. He never hurried off the phone. He always had time for you, sometimes more time than you had time for. This made him a natural teacher, and that was lucky for us because he had at his fingertips a remarkable range of practical knowledge to pass along. He taught us to ski and skate and shoot, and sail, and he schooled us in this methodical, analytical approach he had to most problems, which allowed him to fix virtually any mechanical device. It's true that some years we didn't get Christmas presents until like the next summer. And we had this mini bike that sat in the corner of the living room, partially assembled until long after I was mini. When we moved into this little house in Alstead, New Hampshire, here in 91, it was a place where the doors didn't shut because the building had settled. And though my dad was a carpenter by trade, instead of just planing the doors to fit the new frame shape, he decided to place bottle jacks at strategic locations under the house. And so as not to break anything by rushing, he started cranking them at a rate of about 1 revolution a month. The house had been settling for probably 60 years, and he seemed happy to spend another 60 years fixing it. This was home improvement on like a geologic time scale. Meanwhile, the place had no doors, and if you weren't careful, peeing was a spectator sport. James Hilton in Lost Horizons describes Shangri-La as a place where you have so much time that you enjoy sunsets as men in the outer world hear the chimes of a clock. And maybe this is the stubborn adoration of a son for his father, but I choose to believe that my dad wasn't just a wicked procrastinator. I like to believe that he was operating on a different clock than I was, my hummingbird wings to his elephant heart. But his liberty from time had more serious consequences too. When I was much littler, we lived in another old house out in the boonies, and despite having time, tools, and opportunity, Dad never really finished it, so it remained drafty and without central heat through some pretty wicked cold winters. I had 7 older siblings, and even we were outnumbered by mice in the kitchen who were so comfortable that you'd flick on the light, they would like huddle and plan their escape routes, high five before they took off. But his inability or refusal to follow through roiled his own father and was probably one of the reasons that drove my folks to divorce. But rather than linger on those minutes, I want to zoom forward to this one. In 1998, my dad is driving me back to boarding high school. It's November, which means cold before you're ready and dark too early. I start thinking about the mountain of work I have to to complete for classes the next day, and about the fact that those grades are going to be seen by colleges, determining not only where I go, but my job when I graduate and my station in life, the value of my time on earth. This pressure of this future is rushing toward me. Some of the young folks in the crowd might be able to relate. So when we stopped for sandwiches and my dad asked me what I want to drink, something cracks in me, and actually through tears, I say, it doesn't matter. I think, who cares? My dad didn't give me a lot of direct fatherly advice, but that next moment stands out. He looks at me and says, hey, dude, of course it matters. Zoom forward 12 years. I'm eating dinner at my desk in an investment bank in central London. I wear nice suits. I fly first class. I think I'm ahead of the clock. I'm the youngest VP in the firm. Big cheese. But my time is not my own. The hours are long. The client dinners are mandatory. I have a colleague who jokes that after these long weeks, he walks into his own kitchen and his kids burst into tears because they think there's a burglar in the house. Like many around us, his bank account is healthier than his body. But the phone rings, and it's my brother, offering me a bib to the Boston Marathon in 3 weeks. I agree immediately, cut out of the office early, and run east along the Thames River, past noisy pubs and lighted office towers out through the quiet streets of Greenwich. And when I can't run anymore, I take a cab home, exhausted but happy. And in that moment, something of the veneer of that lifestyle has cracked again, and I've started making plans. Just 3 years later, but no longer being an investment banker, I have 3 weeks to spend with my dad opening up the family summer property in Maine. And that sounds fancy, I know, but we're more Clampetts than Kennedys, actually. It's just fixing a lot of rusted old stuff every spring. But Rain's got us pinned inside, so we're working on his old motorcycle. Now, this is a bike. I remember him plunking me on the gas tank when I was little between his arms. As a teen, it was the bike that I learned to ride on, but it's been sitting for a decade and needs rebuilding. So in the mornings over coffee, we're leafing through the manual and talking. In the evenings, we're kind of admiring our work and talking. And after 3 or 4 days, we drop in a fresh battery, inflate the tires, roll it out of the barn. He insists that I be the one to start it. And there's a moment when I crank it over, when it sputters and spits and coughs, and then it starts. My dad was a loving man, but he wasn't one to gush, and hugs between us past the age of about 12 were kind of a shoulder-to-shoulder affair. But when that bike starts, I don't have time to react before he leans across it and gives me a hug. Full, lingering, frontal, breaking all the man hug rules. And then, because my weight on the seat has shorted out the battery, he steps back and says, hey, your crotch is on fire. We managed. But later that same week, actually, the summer's started, weather's beautiful, house is full of family, and it's buzzing with dinner prep. It's cocktail hour. The last of the boaters are coming up from the water, and my dad takes a seat on a couch where he would have been able to survey the whole scene. And there's a moment where he takes a labored breath, and then his heart stops beating. A moment later, I'm giving him chest compressions, my brother at my elbow reminding me to slow down. But he's already gone. He's early for the first time in his life. At 66, he's finally rid himself of the only metronome he's ever carried. That brings us back to now, this moment with you all. I married my dream girl. We have this perfect daughter. I have time to read great books with my English classes and run every mile with the cross-country team I coach. By any measure, I am a very lucky man. Now, maybe Zenos Paradox is solved with a little calculus, or maybe the premise is false. I don't know. But what is a life if not a string of a million moments? What I do know, I think, is that when I think of my dad, each of those moments exists, persists. And as he might say, each one matters. This is every day of my daughter's life so far, 50 weeks. Now, her moments stream out in front of her, and all my dad's moments are in the past. They have none in common. I don't want to be my dad. I want her to have heat, first of all. But when I manage to slow down, to unhook from time, to really be with her, it sure feels like I've bridged the gap between these two great loves of mine. So, each morning I make her breakfast, and each night before bedtime, I read her books, and then I scoop her up and we slow dance around the living room. I've started telling her stories of her grandfather. That motorcycle's sitting in the barn in Maine again, and when she's ready, I'm going to plunk her on the gas tank between my arms. Someday, maybe, she'll help me bring it back to life. Thank you.